Hey everyone, so this is the third and longest video for lecture 5 on the industry giants, digital censorship and control. I'm going to look at much more control in this lecture, so I'm going to get straight into it. No musical interlude, but I'll get one for next time. Really, what I want to focus on in this lecture is this kind of question I posed at the end of the previous video about the structure of the internet being something that can be controlling and which encourages different levels of control of people. So in order to understand that, we need to understand the internet itself. So the first real instance of the internet and the initial internet was known as ARPANET. And you can see in the little diagram there what the first connections on ARPANET were between the University of Utah, UC Santa Barbara, UCLA, etc. And this is in the late 60s. So ARPANET was a US government funded and designed network which aimed to create a communication system that would survive a nuclear war. We're talking in the 1960s when the Cold War was at its height, and after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the American government looked at its communications network and, discovered, or they already knew, that everything is centralized in their communications network. Now, if the Soviets were to strike at those points where all communications were centralized, communications would go down. So what they wanted to create was a decentralized network of communications, where if you took out one point, the communications network itself would not go down. So if you have enough points in the network and they can survive points dropping out, then you still have a communications network left behind you. So development of ARPANET and subsequent networks was largely ignored, though, by the government and military once it started, as the Cold War sort of ramped down and the tension for nuclear war sort of decreased in the 70s as we start to get detente. It starts again in the 80s, but then starts to ramp down again towards the end of the 80s and eventually sort of extinguishes in the early 1990s. You have this network left over, developed for this very specific aim, which really was left to sort of academics and enthusiasts. As you can see, most of these points in the original ARPANET are universities. And because of that, ARPANET was sort of left in the hands of universities as a communications mechanism, a fully functioning communications network. And really, the architecture of ARPANET is no different to the internet as we have it today. All you've got is exponentially billions of more points of contact. So this open design is developed organically through protocols. It adds bits to the network. But really, the idea that 2 points connected by phone lines that can transmit data, that really is pretty much what the internet is today, except we've got billions and billions of more points and billions more data and etc, etc. But the basics of it is exactly the same as it once was. So point 1, internet was developed by the US government and the US military. So usage of this network grew through the 70s and 80s. New functions were added, such as IRC, Internet Relay Chat, and email. So you have more opportunities to communicate between people using this network. But this is very much what we call a elite space. You had to have a great amount of knowledge, and you had to have facilities which would facilitate you being able to get online. It wasn't available to everyone. Now, simply, the realistic option for that was most people didn't have a home computer at that point, didn't have access to it through phone lines and what have you. So it was actually very, very difficult for people, if you weren't in this world, to be part of this scene. So the internet develops as what we call an epistocracy. And an epistocracy means people who have particular knowledge are an elite. And in this case, you had to have knowledge of computing, telecommunications, etc. While it remained very unknown for most people in the 70s and 80s, some people were paying attention. And if you want to see an image of what people thought the internet might be like, William Gibson's Neuromancer, which is one of my favorite books, gives you an excellent image of what the internet, and indeed things like virtual reality, would be like. At that time, no government is really thinking of control of the internet because the internet is very small scale. There's very few people using it. Now, following the development of the protocols of the World Wide Web at CERN in the early 90s, kudos, of course, to Tim Berners-Lee in the image there, combination of graphics, text, and other content on single pages led to an absolute explosion of websites, content on the internet. We go from a text-based communication system to a multimedia communication system, and all of a sudden everyone wants to get online, and the web, which runs on the internet. It's very important to have these layers, right? Internet is the base, the web runs on top of it, and today we have all sorts of platforms like Facebook, etc., which run on the internet as well, and they run side by side to the web. This combination of these elements, which actually made the internet via the World Wide Web, into a multimedia environment, led to not just an explosion of websites, but also an explosion of users. And with an explosion of users, you get lots of graphic and adult-oriented material on a largely self-policing platform, and this becomes an issue. So, the first attempt to limit usage and control usage of the internet comes in 1996. The US Communications Decency Act became the first attempt specifically at controlling pornography on the web. Pornography on the web in the 90s and even the 2000s as well, before social media really became huge, pornography was the biggest driver of traffic on the web. There is no doubt about it. But that's not unusual for consumer media in any way, shape or form. In response in 1996 to the act from the US government, you have John Perry Barlow's Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. Governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. We have no elected government, nor are we likely to have one, so I address you with no greater authority than that which liberty itself always speaks. I declare the global social space we are building to be naturally independent of the tyrannies you seek to impose on us. You have no moral right to rule us, nor do you possess any methods of enforcement, etc., etc. Barlow's Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace is extremely important in the history of cyberpunk, in the history of cyberspace studies, really in the history of computing as a social science. And it shows that there was a reluctance, obviously, amongst those who had been involved in the development of communities online, both in the 80s. John Perry Barlow was involved in online communities going way back before 1996, to resist any attempt at control of this network communication system by government. Ironically, of course, as I already said, the internet was really created by the US government and the US military. But by this point, 30 years on from then, you have a strong movement towards resisting any measures of control. And this kind of sets up the dichotomy that we have from this point onwards. People want to resist control, and they want to say control is wrong. And governments are very, very interested, and governments and, as we see, other organisations are very, very interested in controlling the online environment. Spoiler alert, the governments win. And in particular, it's not even governments that win, it is the companies that eventually win. Barlow's Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace is important for us to understand about the mindset of people who were online at that time. But the truth is, they lost the war, and control is now diffuse across all things that run on the internet. In 1997, the CDA was rejected as unconstitutional in the United States, but Barlow was extremely wrong about cyberspace, in particular, the idea that cyberspace is not controllable. Cyberspace is in fact a real material space. There are wires, machines, devices, servers, etc., which are all dependent on software made by programmers that can develop control mechanisms in them. And then cyberspace is largely made up of platforms that are physical presences that can be controlled. And governments also have numerous ways of controlling the network nature of the internet. And so what I'm going to do is go through some of those elements of control now. First thing that governments can do is control ISPs, internet service providers. Governments control the space within their borders and the operations of organisations in that space, and we probably want it to be that way. And basically, they can order the net to be shut down or for sites to be blocked. This is very common in authoritarian regimes. So during the Arab Spring of 2011, even actually preceding the Arab Spring, Egypt was very much into cutting off the internet and cell services to stop communications between protesters. This is something that many countries around the world do on a regular basis. You can also have control by law. For example, the 2000 French government action versus Yahoo over sites making Nazi memorabilia available in France. To own Nazi memorabilia is a criminal offence in France. So the French government took action over Yahoo that was hosting sites that were selling Nazi memorabilia, basically shut down Yahoo. You have geographic filtering of things. This is my favourite thing with Netflix, right? Netflix UK, it's okay, but Netflix US is much better. So of course, as I'm technologically savvy, I run proxies and so on my computers, so I can pick up Netflix USA and watch the programs on Netflix USA. And every couple of weeks, Netflix moves and changes that and so on. And this kind of geographic filtering, this is by a company, but it's also contingent on all sorts of copywriting issues which go on in UK law. So I'm actually breaking UK law when I do it as well. Do I care? Not really. The European Union directive on the right to be forgotten allows search engine results to be removed from search providers in the EU. Now you can get around the right to be forgotten just by searching for somebody on a different search engine outside of the EU. It's very easy to do. What happens to the right to be forgotten when we finally leave the EU? God, that's been going on so long. In January next year. Is yet, I've not really seen whether it's going to be repealed or anything, but the right to be forgotten is a very, very important piece of legislature that says in the geographic area of the European Union, you can request to be forgotten by companies like Google. They'd have no right to actually provide information on you if you don't want them to. So there are laws to control what goes on online. You can also control services. So there's, for example, I'm sure we've all been familiar, lots of copyright takedowns on YouTube. Facebook removes pages, tweets and accounts are removed by Twitter, and we're going to see a huge flood of this at the moment because you're going to have US election coming up, and Twitter certainly is going to be very active in removing pages and accounts and tweets. Whether Facebook is going to be that active against QAnon and things like that, we remain to see. I'm really skeptical. This is like a very local rather than global filtering, but it shows some of the control that can go on, and governments can force companies like Facebook and Twitter to do this. You can also control financial systems. Remember, websites and so on need financial backing. Things don't run for free. So payments for services can be stopped by governments, for example. So in 2006, MasterCard and Visa presented purchases from the Russian site allofmp3.com, which is offering songs online at very cheap rates without obviously paying the artists involved any royalties. So it was a copyright infringement. So MasterCard and Visa basically said you couldn't use their cards. There really aren't any other cards that you could use, so that was the end of all of mp3.com. In 2010, payments to WikiLeaks via PayPal was blocked. That led to a whole thing where Anonymous started attacking PayPal and doing direct denial of service attacks on PayPal and so on. So it set off a kind of proxy war going on with advocates for freedom. And I'll come to WikiLeaks and Anonymous later. But governments can force control of financial systems in order to take down things they don't like. You can also control domain name systems. These are the things which translate names into IP addresses. If a DNS is removed, then a site can only be found through an IP address, basically, which is a long string of numbers, very hard to find and very hard to index. So it takes it basically out of search engines as well. So Vote Auction, which was a site set up in 2000, where you could post up adverts saying, I will sell my vote in the 2000 US presidential election to whoever wants to buy it. And so you paid this person to go and vote the way you wanted them to. In an election that was so close as the 2000 US presidential election, yeah, that was really problematic. So the domain name system being stripped from that meant people couldn't really find Vote Auction anymore. That was really, that's a weird one, because that was kind of attempt at trolling and was trying to make a meta point about the nature of democracy in the United States rather than being outwardly malicious, but the result of it was probably going to be very malicious. Of course, you can control companies as a government too. So companies operating in territories could be shut down. In 2006, the Swedish government shut down the Pirate Bay, the torrenting aggregator site. Season 2 had 200 servers from them. Instantly reappeared. They raided it again in 2014. Pirate Bay still exists today. It's a sad sort of copy of what it used to be, because basically you can't use it now unless you download their IP, their VP software, and because of that, it's basically become an advertising site for, you know, sort of proxies and things like that. But it still exists, but the Swedish government has been trying to shut it down basically for like 14 years. What's the difficulty of doing this, of course, is just as the Pirate Bay did in 2006, you seize the physical infrastructure and they just switch everything to servers abroad where the government's not going to do that. So it's a very stupid way of trying to shut down a company. Governments have got better ways of shutting down companies than that. Of course, countries can control individuals. People can be arrested, you know, equipment can be seized. I've got an example here of a Bangladeshi blogger, I shouldn't laugh, who was hacked to death in 2015. So, you know, publicized by government and by media, and then gone after by an angry mob. In 2013 in the UK, Greenwald and Miranda, who were the two journalists working with Edward Snowden to release his work in The Guardian and New York Times, they had their hard drives containing information on Snowden smashed by the UK government when they arrived in London. I think it was Greenwald who told them at the time, look, this is a pointless exercise because we've already backed it up online. And they did it anyway, and Greenwald and Miranda lost absolutely nothing. And it was just one of the most stupid things I've ever seen. You've got these idiots smashing up hard drives with sledgehammers, and the two journalists are saying, you know, we backed it up. It's saved. What are you doing? But you know, governments do try to control individuals. And what the interesting reason why I use that example is UK government tries to control individuals. One of the most important things that goes on, though, is not necessarily related to the state or government or law. It's control through moderation. The platforms that we use on a day-to-day basis are generally moderated. Excuse me. So following Tarleton Gillespie's 2018 book, The Custodians of the Internet, he traces out really how control is maintained by the very platforms we use: Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple, etc. He argues that moderation shapes platforms themselves, and the rules of moderation become systems and institutions in their own right that guide our very online lives. So moderation is always intentional and is always guided by the organization's aims itself, not necessarily government aims, and certainly not the aims that we have as users. These are aims put forward by the organization, usually in the pursuit of more revenue through advertising. So therefore, online life is shaped by the aims and organizations that control platforms themselves. So Gillespie's argument is reasonably straightforward. In terms of platforms, those things which host, organize and circulate users' shared content without having produced or commissioned that content. So if you think of like Instagram, you know, Instagram as a platform hosts our photos, but didn't ask us to do them, we did them anyway. It's built on infrastructure for processing data for profit through advertising. These platforms are never neutral. They have devised rules to protect organizational aims, i.e. their business model. So an interesting case for me is on Instagram. If I took my t-shirt off now and took a photo of myself and put it on Instagram, I'd be fine. If a woman does it, it gets taken down. Why? What's the difference? It boils down to how Instagram wants to sell itself to advertisers. At the end of the day, does Facebook really care about female nudity? I doubt that it does. And if you look into the history of Facebook and how it was formed, you would come to the conclusion that no, Mark Zuckerberg certainly doesn't care about whether women show off their bodies or not. But advertisers do. And yeah, and Facebook wants to keep its platforms in a particular manner that allows for as much advertising to go on as possible on them, which means you try to offend as few people as possible, including, offending parents of children and so on. So you keep female nudity off the site, but men being semi-nude, that's okay, because as a societal norm, apparently that's fine. Platforms are never neutral. And the content that you post up, if it is in violation, if it is moderated in some way, it is being moderated very often because it damages the business aims of that platform. So really, the terms and conditions and community guidelines become a discursive performance. These things, now going back to previous lecture when I talked about power, ideology and discourse, here we have terms and conditions and community guidelines are a form of discourse used to legitimize a particular ideology. In the context of these companies, it's their ideological position to make as much money through as much advertising as possible. That means these things are a discursive. The reason why Gillespie calls them a discursive performance is because it's not a real discourse. It's a performative act. It's a gesture rather than a law. But it's also a gesture on both sides. It makes it look like, we sign up for these things and we're agreeing to them, but we're not really agreeing to them, because if we don't abide by them, we can't post anything. There is no right or wrong here. These are just the rules. So freedom of expression on social media has a massive but by it. The rules are almost unenforceable unless somebody complains, but there's always somebody to complain, right? Believe me, there's always somebody to complain. So in terms of control through moderation, the rules establish self-censorship basically in users. We know what we can and can't do on social media sites. We understand these parameters and we don't push them. But they're only a discourse on what we allowed to generate revenue in the end of the day. So the three moderation solutions: editorial review by platform, community flagging, and automatic detection. These are the ways that social media companies moderate, if you like. And it leads to some bizarre instances, and I'll come back to this photo later, but this is one of the most famous photographs of all time, I would argue, from the Vietnam War. This got pulled down by Facebook because it has female nudity in it. Now, the context of that female, I'm not arguing that it doesn't have female nudity in it, but the context of that female nudity is extremely important. If you understand that this girl running away from what is behind, you look behind, you think, is that a storm? Is that... No, that's a napalm. And that child's clothes have burned off her body. It is one of the most, like I say, one of the most famous war photographs of all time, showing the utter devastation and misery cast upon the lives of Vietnamese children during the Vietnam War. Pulled by Facebook through an automatic detection algorithm that said female nudity, it's got to come down. So really, we have massive amounts of control of what we can do online. If you look at John Perry Barlow's statement, it's completely gone. Now, in some parts of the world, we also have mass censorship online. This, perhaps we might think, isn't a factor in the West. I disagree, but I'll go through some of the methods of mass censorship anyway. And mass censorship is there to control political ideas of opposition, offences against religious or cultural norms, preventing instability. This is why the Great Firewall can be seen in this context in China. It limits openness with no challenges to the political order itself. So the Great Firewall, how does it work? Well, it uses actually American-based routers as filters. So it's based in America to block access to the World Wide Web and internet services through 8 gateways to the internet. So filters by web address and keywords can be bypassed the Great Firewall. It's not infallible, but the penalties for doing so are very, very dangerous. The Golden Shield acts as a firewall that replicates Western services for local provision, basically. So you've got QQ for Facebook, Baidu for Google, Weibo for Twitter, WeChat for everything. So without algorithmic control of platforms. So these two systems together, the Great Firewall, which blocks off the outside internet, and the Golden Shield, which replicates what goes on in the internet outside of China, act together to automate surveillance and the present information in a government-friendly format. This is how the Chinese have decided to set up the internet in order to maintain the political and sort of control networks that exist in China. Sounds fine, it sounds grim if you're from the West, until you understand that, we don't have the same kind of things perhaps, but we do have organizations like GCHQ and the CIA and so on, basically monitoring all web traffic anyway, with assistance from Google, Facebook, etc. So it's not really that different. Now, you have also other regimes of control in the world. See Cuba, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Iran, Pakistan. There's often cultural or religious basis for those levels of control and can have wide consequences. In 2008, Pakistan blocked YouTube because of certain material that was posted online of a religious nature. That blocking of YouTube in Pakistan knocked out YouTube for hundreds and thousands of millions of other people around the world and caused a major outrage at that time. So, this kind of control happens in a lot of countries around the world. Undeniably, these are political issues. The internet allows for the access to global flows and information, and those flows can carry content that threatens traditional authority, belief systems, and power elites. But freedom of information is in a dialectical relationship with morality, local cultures, and political power at all times. And so we see, I think that, the very idea that, we can have a free space for expression is always in conflict with the reality of the political situation around the world. It's very, very wrong to think that censorship doesn't happen in the West. Censorship by states for political, moral, and social ends is very, very common in the West too. Just try and sort of go on the Pirate Bay or something like that. You will get your ISP saying you can't go on this site if you're with like Sky or Virgin or somebody, they've been told to do that by the government. So there is restriction on what we can do online in the West too. That's also the case in the United States, by the way. If you do want to pirate stuff online, I would recommend using the Tor browser, but just keep in mind that the Tor browser is also American military material. We also get instances of the digital giants themselves being pressured to conform to sort of calls by politicians to block things. So this was back in the London riots of 2011. Louise Mensch, was asking for Twitter and so on to be actually blocked out during the riots. One way to stop people communicating during the riots apparently was to pull down all communications networks. That's a fairly totalitarian response, but it's not something unusual in politics in the West. Facebook undoubtedly is a platform for control. Facebook bans things like offensive breast cancer awareness videos, which is actually showing women how to check for lumps and how to be vigilant about breast cancer. Facebook says, no, our advertisers won't like that. Down you go. We don't care if it's about cancer, we care about profit. In terms of revenge porn and so on, I mean, this is so ridiculous. So in 2017, given increases in the use of the Facebook platforms, I'm not just talking about one platform here, I'm talking really about things like WhatsApp as well. Facebook asked users to submit naked pictures of themselves to Facebook in order to prevent these images being spread across its network. Facebook encodes that image, then lodges that code in its databases and flags up any other image that has the same code or a similar code that requires investigation, and therefore could spark a criminal investigation if revenge porn is discovered as a motive. Do you want Facebook to own your naked selfies? If you do, if you think this is a good idea, I'd really suggest you investigate Facebook's ethics and business model a little more. Unsurprisingly, very few people took up this really stunning opportunity to give Facebook control over their bodies in this way. Facebook's attempts at controlling communications involve giving them more control all the time. In terms of blocking inappropriate content, now Facebook eventually did a U-turn over this because it was so ridiculous at the end of the day. But this kind of blocking of inappropriate content goes on all the time. So Facebook as a platform acts to control it in that way. Twitter censors very, very consistently. So this was just after the 2016 US presidential election, suspending a lot of people who was identified as white nationalists and alt-right in the US. It's done another tranche of this year. So there's control that goes on that side. Now, I mean, I don't like these people, and I don't agree with what they say and so on. But you know, I'm not upset that these people get thrown off Twitter. Put it like that. You know, I'm quite happy to see them go down. You know, I hate them, but it does act as an example of how Twitter as a platform is involved in control of its own platform, and that raises significant questions for us, because the current president of the United States, as I'm saying this, is on Twitter. And now, if I did what Donald Trump does on Twitter on a daily basis, I'd never be on there. I would have been banned years ago. I could not get away with it, so why can Trump get away with it? So Twitter really is really inconsistent. And the question you need to ask yourself is, okay, so why can't Leighton act like Donald Trump on Twitter? Is because Leighton's a nobody, all right? And people will find him offensive. Now, people find Trump offensive on Twitter as well, but that generates traffic because he's such an important figure in the world, and he was before he was president, and he's going to be after he's president as well. So Twitter's never getting rid of Trump, because Trump drives traffic for Twitter, and what does that do? Drives revenue. So the leader of the free world being, you know, a white supremacist dick is fine. Leighton being not a white supremacist or anything, obviously, but, you know, dick, he can't do it. So controlling information that contrasts with dominant ideologies of political or economic elites really happens quite a lot on social media. What's the purpose of this? There's an aim for a hegemonic influence through the suppression of information and suppression of opposition. So really, we're back to some of the issues I've already discussed previously in terms of why control happens on these platforms and what the business model of control really means for us as a culture. Some things will get banned and some things won't get banned, and the things which ideologically fit in with the dominant ideas of a ruling class, the hegemonic ideas in society, they remain, and ideas outside of that view are more likely to get banned. So commercially, you're blocking views that might cost revenue through clicks and advertising, but culturally then we're promoting particular types of culture and particular ideas and particular ideologies within a culture above others. So this form of censorship really shapes society and shapes, you know, how social media affects society and how it's, you know, social media is integral to contemporary society. So power relationships have changed, but power dynamics and the functions of power really have not changed over time. Michel Foucault classifies this kind of thing as regimes of control. So information services act as a machine, one of many machines in a society, in a regime of discipline that creates subjects. I need to unpack that a little bit, but what Foucault is saying is that basically how information is regulated creates, if you're subjects, by what he means by subjects is really people. It creates different kinds of people. The systems of control in our society, these, you know, regimes of discipline, they create subjects in our society, and we are creating different kinds of people through these methods of control. So information and the flows of information act not to inform people of things, but to create discourses through which power flows in society, and that's what creates different kinds of subject in society, people who are easy to control and people who listen to power. And this is what is affected when information is shared, as well as the content of information that is shared in a society. So if you control what information gets out there, what information gets shared, what information gets made visible to you, remember, social media companies control what they show us. You know, our timelines are carefully curated by social media companies to give us a particular view of the world. And that creates a particular subject. We are being created by the media that we use, and Foucault was talking about this a very long time ago, back in the 1970s. It's even more intense today. So we call this entire system a system of governmentality. How power is legitimized in society is closely related to the information flows of a society. And social media is absolutely critical to how information flows in our society and how information affects us as individuals. And when we understand that the social media companies are involved in mass systems, not just of surveillance, but also control of information, then we'll understand that actually the aim of that is to make us into a particular kind of subject, a pliant, sort of obedient subject that will be a nice little consumer and that won't kick off a big fuss when you see that our government is absolutely hopeless at everything, for example. It's not working very well in my case, but it's working for a hell of a lot of people out there. You know, we've had what? If you believe the government's figures, 40,000, but if you believe the excess death figures, more than 60,000 deaths through coronavirus, and yet there are still nearly half the people in the UK think that the government's done a good job. Wow. Flows of information are controlled very, very well. Now, is there resistance to this? There have been attempts at resistance, but kind of resistance is futile in many ways. The main sources of resistance are social media and peer technologies, the transparency movement, hacktivism, and the law itself. But resistance is hard. So individuals can be empowered via social media to take images and share images. Of course, we see this with regards to Black Lives Matter. You know, and the footage of George Floyd, that horrendous footage, which I'm sure some of you have seen, very, very difficult to watch, but which has sparked an entire protest movement, which did exist before the George Floyd incident in Minneapolis. Black Lives Matter did exist before then, but galvanized, if you like, that movement during the summer of 2020. And there's a lot of historical examples of this also, which I've listed on this slide. So social media can be leveraged to do this. However, it can be leveraged only to the extent that the platform will allow you to do it. It's not a surprise to me that Twitter, which has less problematic views on content, that's where George Floyd blew up, rather than Facebook, where I think it would have been taken down. People would have got to see it, but it would have been taken down eventually. So yeah, it all depends really on the platform that's being used. But okay, so social media is, we can resist from within, if you like. Now the transparency movement is motivated by liberal beliefs that transparency is best for justice and democracy, and government activities should be public. The transparency movement is all about making everything clear. So it's about, governments act in secret, that we should make their ways of doing things public to everyone as well. So blockchain actually is a technique for this, according to Rachel O'Dwyer, but transparency movement hasn't got very far. It's very well intentioned. It has very sort of positive ideas on how things should be done, but it ain't going to happen. In terms of hacktivism, we have WikiLeaks and so on. So Julian Assange registers the site. He was an Australian hacker in 2006. AIM was for a worldwide repository of leaked information. So Chelsea Manning in 2010, the Afghan war logs were leaked. In October 2010, the Iraq war logs were leaked, giving information on what happened in those conflicts from the American side and what kind of atrocities occurred. The public deserved to know the truth about the war. In 2010, the US diplomatic cables leaked the biggest leak in history. WikiLeaks has been accused of treason in the United States, a foreign terrorist organization they've been accused of being. So here's probably the most famous attempt at, committing itself to transparency by taking stolen information. Is it stolen information even? Taking information from governments and publishing online so that citizens have the right, can exercise the right to know what their government does in their name. In terms of WikiLeaks and Cyberwar, they were, governments try to take down WikiLeaks by launching attacks on their sites, direct denial of service attacks. Amazon removed it from cloud services. PayPal, Visa, and MasterCard removed the services. Defenses of WikiLeaks were launched by Anonymous, so they tried to take down PayPal and Visa, for example. It became a mess. And, you know, in terms of where WikiLeaks ends up, remember, this is an organization committed in its first instance to the promotion of, you know, information and to empowering citizens, that ends up in 2016 in league with Russia, trying to discredit Hillary Clinton through leaked reports and basically becoming a conduit for Vladimir Putin and in support of Trump. So you might want to ask yourself questions of, you know, what the hell happened here, because this was not the aims of it. WikiLeaks effectively sort of gave up on its mission. I mean, there are other hacktivist organizations out there. So Anonymous themselves, LulzSec, usually use coordinated direct denial of services with botnet armies. You can see this in Gabrielle Coleman's work. They're free speech and anti-censorship. Basically, the idea is that information must be free. So that's the ongoing influence of John Perry Barlow. They did things like an anti-Scientology campaign from 2006, or attacked in defense of WikiLeaks. Originally around 4chan and Pol, on the B and Pol boards, using IRC as channels for discussion, but now really they've disappeared from 4chan in particular. You know, 4chan's gone heavily right-wing since sort of 2012, 2013, and you know, the anonymous influence on it has disappeared. It's really a destructuralized sort of attack group, but Anonymous these days have little influence anymore. They were big in the 2010s, and their form of resistance seems to have disappeared also. You can have resistance through law as well, so organizations fighting for transparency through the Electronic Frontier Foundation in the US, Liberty in the UK, the Pirate Party across Europe as well, which has won representation and local government in some areas. But really, where are we at in terms of control? We've kind of lost. The battle is gone. The dialectic relationship between freedom of information and expression versus control has been won by control. We do want information. Do we really want information to even be free? You know, we have free-for-alls online where people are just giving out information all the time. This is the root of fake news, for example. You know, maybe control isn't so much of a bad thing. Now, too much control can be authoritarian, but too little control can lead to sort of a debasement of democratic values and the way that we exist in society. So total freedom could lead to an even more post-truth world. So we have to be careful what we wish for, but we do have to recognize that the very business models of digital media companies mean that our lives, and people often say online lives, there's no such thing as an online life, right? These are integrated into everything we do. So our lives are controlled in ways that we often don't understand, but I hope you understand more about now. Okay, that's the end of this lecture. Thanks very much.